Hi, this is Bob Kingston, Portland Opera's resident historian and lecturer. Welcome to this short video introduction on Mozart's Don Giovanni. People have been debating whether Don Giovanni is a comic or a serious opera ever since it premiered. Mozart referred to it as an opera buffa, which means comic opera, but Da Ponte called it a dramma giocoso, which is a kind of a fancy term. It literally means jocular drama. There are elements of both comic and dramatic in this work. Mozart was very interested in exploring in this work that kind of middle world that exists between comedy and drama. He created three different levels of characters as he had done in the Marriage of Figaro. So we have characters who are clearly comic, like Zerlina, Mazzetto, and Leporello. We have characters who are really taken from the world of serious opera, Donna Anna and Don Ottavio. And then we have characters who occupy a kind of middle ground. Don Giovanni, certainly, but also the character of Donna Elvira. They kind of have their feet in both camps. There's a comic aspect to them, but there's also something serious about them. I think really audiences take away from the opera both aspects. There are times when the opera is clearly meant to be comic, but the end seems to betray that. How can a comic opera end with someone being dragged down to hell and with the music Mozart wrote for that great final scene? The question really remains unanswerable. The sources for the Don Juan story go back at least as far as the Middle Ages, but it was in the 17th century when a Spanish monk named Tirso de Molina wrote a dramatic version of it called El Burlador de Sevilla, which means the trickster of Seville. And in that story, we have this kind of ne'er-do-well who really makes more of a game out of tricking his conquests. The focus really isn't so much on Don Juan as a great lover as it is on somebody who is all about the practical jokes. That version worked its way down. There were other dramatic versions. Molière wrote a play in which he introduces the character of Don Elvira. There was a play by Carlo Goldoni, which was an attempt to kind of resurrect the story and rescue it from some of the popular elements that had seeped in with the Commedia dell'arte. And then the immediate source, one that Mozart's librettist Lorenzo Da Ponte most certainly knew, and Mozart also most certainly knew as well, was an opera that debuted in 1787, the same year that Don Giovanni premiered in Prague, written by a composer named Giuseppe Gazzaniga with a libretto by Bertotti. And this libretto in many ways served as the basis for the libretto that Da Ponte provided for the opera he gave to Mozart. Lorenzo Da Ponte is one of the great characters in opera. He almost deserves his own opera. He's so wonderful. He was a baptized Jew who lived in Venice. He was a friend of Casanova. He was forced to leave Venice because of scandalous behavior and because of extremely controversial teachings. And he made his way to Vienna, where he served as the court poet for Emperor Joseph II. He met Mozart in 1783. Mozart was initially very suspicious of Da Ponte because he was Italian. Mozart felt that all of the Italian musicians working in Vienna were kind of in league with each other, and since Mozart was not a native-born Italian, he felt a bit of the outsider. But eventually they collaborated. Their first complete opera was the Marriage of Figaro, then Don Giovanni, and then finally Così fan tutte. So what happened to Da Ponte after his collaboration with Mozart, I think, is even as interesting. He was let go from his imperial service after the death of Joseph II. He moved to England, and then he relocated to Pennsylvania, where he ran a general store. He eventually found his way to New York, where he operated a bookstore. And one of his regular customers was Clement Moore, the author of the very famous Christmas poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. And it was through Clement Moore that Da Ponte secured a position as a professor of Italian at Columbia University, and he ran the program there for a number of years. He was also still involved in working with opera while he lived in the United States. He produced a production of Don Giovanni in 1825. He was very instrumental in promoting Rossini's music, and he opened the first opera house in the United States. I think Da Ponte is one of the most remarkable characters in all of opera, and we're so fortunate that he and Mozart had this short and very powerful collaboration, three of the great operas in the repertoire. We know a fair amount about who the singers were, but unfortunately a lot of their activities were undocumented. We know, for instance, that three of the singers who took part in the premiere of Don Giovanni in Prague were also performing in the Prague premiere of The Marriage of Figaro. There may have been two others, but we don't really know for sure. We have contemporary accounts of their vocal and dramatic abilities. We know that a couple of the singers were actually very young. Giovanni Bassi, who created the role of Don Giovanni, was 21, and Teresa Saporiti, who was the first Donna Anna, was 24. Interestingly enough, the singer who debuted the role of Zerlina, Caterina Bondini, who was married to one of the two impresarios who had this theater company in Prague, was already the mother of four and was pregnant during the performance of Don Giovanni. What we know about these singers comes from rather mixed sources. We're lucky if we find out what their activities were. They frequently were very itinerant and moved around quite a bit. But fortunately, we do have some information about who these first singers were and what their activities were connected with Mozart. Well, Mozart worked on Don Giovanni through most of 1787, and the works that audiences would be most familiar with from this period are two very interesting and very contrasting works. A piece called A Musical Joke, and the corresponding work, Eine kleine Nachtmusik. Two very different works, very different kinds of moods and tones, but I think they underscore the fact that Mozart was a master of working with disparate elements, and the balance of comic and drama in Don Giovanni really is evident in his ability to kind of work in these two different areas. He wrote two wonderful string quintets, one in C major and one in G minor, wrote a wonderful rondo for violin and piano, and a number of songs from this period. But for the most part, 1787, Mozart's compositional energies were devoted to completing Don Giovanni. Well, there are four recordings that I think are really essential for anyone who wants to get a handle on this great opera. There's the classic Wilhelm Furtwängler recording with Cesare Siepi, Elizabeth Grumer, and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf from the early 1950s. And then in 1959, there was a great recording with Carlo Maria Giulini, really kind of considered in many ways the definitive recording of Don Giovanni, with Eberhard Wechter as Don Giovanni, Joan Sutherland as Donna Anna, and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf again as Donna Elvira. In 1984, Bernard Haitink made a great recording that was in conjunction with the Glyndebourne Festival performance. And in that recording, we have Thomas Allen as a wonderful Don Giovanni, and Carol Van Ness and Maria Ewing as the two main women. It's a terrific recording and really has something of the sense of the theater about it. And then the last recording that I would recommend dates from 1985. Surprisingly, a conductor that we often don't think of first with Mozart, and that's Herbert von Karajan, a somewhat controversial Mozart conductor, not to everybody's taste. What I like about this recording is that we get the great American bass Samuel Ramey in the title role, and a wonderful Donna Elvira in Agnes Balza, a mezzo, singing a role that's typically given to a larger, more dramatic soprano. So those 4 recordings, I think, would be essential for anyone wanting to get a grip on this great opera.